I think it's important to know that kapa is the Hawaiian word for that substance made out of fiber, plant fiber usually, that is used throughout the tropical zone in many other parts of the world. So that in Samoa it's siapo, in Tonga it's tafa, in Hawaii it's kapa.
Places that didn't have cotton traditions, linens, or woven things ended up somehow discovering that certain tree barks could be beaten and worked out to be able to make things you could cover yourself with.
When the Hawaiians developed this art form after they settled in Hawaii and lost contact with the Central Polynesia, they developed a very high state of the art.
When Polynesians settled the Hawaiian archipelago sometime between 300 and 800 AD, they brought plants that were essential to their way of life. One of the plants they brought was the wauke, Brassanetia papyrifera, or paper mulberry, the plant that was vital to the practice of making kapa. One Hawaiian legend tells us that the goddess Hina could not dry her kapa because the sun traveled too quickly across the sky. Her son Maui stood atop Haleakala, lassoed the sun, and forced it to travel more slowly. Thus, both time and the rhythm of the day as we know it are associated with the cycle of kapa-making.
Kapa in Hawaiian culture was used as clothing. It's beaten, so all the clothing was essentially a rectangle. So the women would wear a wraparound skirt called a pa'u. The men would wear a loincloth and called it a malo. There was like a cloak, shoulder covering, that was called a kihe or kikepa. It was also the blankets. It was also used ceremonially in the temple dressings. It was used on the ki'i, or the statues, when it was that god's time that he was, he ruled or he was awake. It was used extensively in burials.
Though kapa-making is usually thought of as women's work, the complex process also involved men.
Actually, it was a woman's art or a woman's craft. The men were very important though to it. They helped in the planting. They made all the tools. And if the women didn't have the tools that they made, they could not produce this fine grade of fabric that they did produce.
Western cloth was introduced when first contact with the outside world came to the Hawaiian Islands. Western clothing and cloth quickly became part of a new material culture. Cotton cloth was soft, brightly colored, sturdy, and could be washed many, many times, outlasting kapa fiber, which is essentially a paper.
The process for making kapa was a long, arduous, hard work stuff, and with this new fabric, it was so easy to acquire, a pa'u or a shawl, a kihe,
Ironically, kapa-making as a craft reached its zenith after contact, largely due to the introduction of metal. Metal tools allowed for finer carving of kapa tools, and therefore finer design printing inspired by calico. Western cloth may also have motivated kapa makers to imitate the fine texture of cotton. Much of the kapa that Captain James Cook acquired on his voyages was coarse and thick when compared to the soft, thinner kapa made later in the 19th century. Unfortunately, just as kapa making was experiencing this remarkable refinement, It also went into a steep decline. By the 1860s, it was reported that kapa was only seen in its plainer forms in outlying areas, and by 1890, production and use had almost ceased. Kapa-making lay virtually dormant for almost a century until the late 1960s and early 1970s, when a cultural reawakening in Hawaii began to take root. Many Hawaiians realized that over-assimilation had nearly erased valuable cultural practices.
My first recollection of somebody wanting to do it was Malia Solomon, that she started to do some work around the 1960s. And what she did was go to Central Polynesia, and where kapa was still being made by the Samoans and by the Tongans, and got general background there. And then she came home and started to make some pieces here in Hawaii. And then pretty soon along comes people like me and people like Moana Isley, who basic reason why we get involved with all of this is that we have this very strong curiosity. We had to find out, how did they do that,
It was just wanting to know how. And from that, from just wanting to know how, you learned a whole lot of other things. And it's all those other kinds of things like the laulima, like the ahonui, like the kuleana, like the ho'ihi, the respect that you gotta have for all kinds of things. We call them values today, but they were just practical, fundamental ways that fit into everyday life.
Pua Van Dorp is also one of the early kapa makers who did much to research and recover this lost art.
I believe in a lot of things that get passed down genetically, and I think certain kinds of cultural and historical knowledge are part of them. Not just the color of your eyes or the color of your hair, but things that you know and things you're drawn to.
While many of these new kapa makers received some instruction, they relied heavily on the work of early Hawaiian historians, Western anthropologists, and the kapa collections held by various museums. Today, a small number of people in the Hawaiian Islands are actively making kapa, but their ranks are steadily growing. Many kapa makers have had gallery shows and are encouraged by the rising interest in their craft. And once again, kapa is being used for traditional purposes.
I really want it to be more than just find out. I want you to use it. I want you to take it and wrap your body with it. I want you to use it however you have to use it. I don't want it to just sit on the wall someplace and look good.
This is good to get kapa out and in galleries and on walls and in frames. But for me personally, I'm always happier when I can somebody calls me and says, oh, my sister's having a baby and she'd really like a piece of Hawaiian kapa to catch the baby in when it's born. And, or, somebody just passed away and they want to put the ashes in a piece of Hawaiian kapa and they're just going to, put the ashes and put the whole thing in the ocean and let it go.
Kapa is what I want to do. So it's every day, in some way, there's some part of kapa that is in my life, okay? And the practices and those kinds of values that I talked about before, they're a part of me now. And for them to be a part of you, I think that's better than life-changing.
I think my inspiration for making kapa, the main one, is to be able to preserve a particular tradition of our culture that was lost and to make sure that it's never lost again. This is why the teaching component is so important for me.
It's fulfilling and it's make my life worth, I guess you can say worth living, especially at this old age when it's just not something to do. It's something that really brings me satisfaction and joy. I love doing it.